broaden the security definition.
Yeah.
That security is not only military and political, security is also the developmental aspects, not least in today's world environment and water scarcity, for instance. And unfortunately, this has been picked up. When I was Deputy Secretary of the UN, when I pushed this issue in the Security Council, we were met with a lot of skepticism. And people were not willing to do it. But now, growingly, people have seen that drought and hunger and all these factors lead to conflict. Then, now it's fortunate to come up. And here, I want to commend the government and Sweden and the Security Council, where you have succeeded in bringing in these issues. So that is I would say the conceptual answer to your question.
I want to come back in a moment, Ephraim, to exactly this issue of, there's less pushback now. There's still some, but there's less. But first of all, as part of the kind of setting the context of all of this, maybe you could say a little bit about, from World Food Programme's perspective, the partnership that we've started up and where WFP believes it can gain from this.
Yes, thank you, Jan. I'd like to pick up where Jan ended on saying that where there's conflict, there's hunger. And that is actually quite well documented. There were a few reports coming out late last year. One of them, the flagship report called State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World. And for the first time in a decade, the number of hungry people has actually increased. It increased from 770 million people in 2016 up to 815 million people in 2017. So that's a really, really worrying trend. It sounds weird to call it a trend, but that's a really worrying fact that the number is increasing in spite of all the good efforts that is being made through international collaboration, the Agenda 2030. It's really sounding the alarm that will we be able eventually to reach a world with zero hunger in 2030. The reason for the increase in number of hungry people is the number of complex and protracted crises. You have the conflict in Syria, which is going on for more than 7 years, South Sudan, more than 4 years, Yemen, more than 3 years. So you have these protracted conflicts that drives people into desperation and into hunger. So this is quite well documented that conflict drives hunger. There's also a lot of evidence that hunger drives conflict, and I fully agree and appreciate your examples, Jan. From across the world, there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that, for instance, during the peak in the food prices in 2008, there were more than 60 riots that can be sort of traced back to the fact that people were not any longer able to buy their daily bread. The Arab Spring did not only happen because of that people couldn't afford to buy their daily meal, but that was one of the determining factor. Nowadays, we see in Venezuela riots which are also again rooted in inequality, poverty, and the fact that people can no longer feed themselves or their children. And you have about 4,000 people every single day who leave who leave the country, and I think 1.5 million people who are displaced. So, coming back to your question, Dan, the reason for going into this partnership with CIPRI, which is possibly the most well-esteemed research institution in the world on the issue of peace and hunger, peace and conflict, we want to expand the evidence base that hunger actually leads to conflict, and that by solving hunger, by building food security, we can actually contribute significantly into an agenda of sustained peace. That's part of it. That's the reason.
And I think for us, the World Food Programme is the world's largest humanitarian organization, and it's one that has been criticized, let's be frank, sometimes over how it has delivered that food aid. It's also recognized internally that there are issues there to explore. It's developed an agenda about peace building from 2013, and it's taken the Sustainable Development Goals as being a possibility to start linking up the different parts in the way that Jan was saying, that there's no peace without development and no development without peace. So Ephraim, you've been in this position now for a bit, and you've seen these issues being argued out at the kind of the high policy level. And Jan was reflecting that, well, it's very much changed over a decade. So tell us where you see it sitting now.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to Sipri and for organizing this important conversation. On the 24th of May, we adopted this resolution on the hunger and conflict, and it was a first. And Jan, you know this, but others might too, that the Security Council can, on occasions, be allergic to introducing new thematics in its agenda. And so 1325 back in the days was a huge gain. Women, peace and security, and now we've certainly established that. And so this is a new thematic angle to the work of the Security Council. So that was important in itself that we were able to adopt the resolution. And we have some particular specific gains through that we have through the resolution. For instance, this vicious cycle, the photo you referred to, Jan and Anna, that hunger is both an effect but also a cause for conflict is now established. And I can tell you that it was difficult to establish this connection that goes in both directions. Some are not too keen on doing that. We also, but I would like to point, apart from the sort of the resolution is policy driving in certain respects like this one, but I would like to say that it's more an enabling and tasking resolution, that it calls on the Secretary General to develop its work on this in this regard, that the Security Council commits to to follow the issue, and that we also have, we've established some kind of principles, but we're also sort of, we also have some paragraphs speaking about the possibility of including even going for sanctions when you use famine as a war method, which is of course an important instrument in the future. But we have a conversation that some of the Security Council members would like to avoid. And it's also because it concerns them directly. I mean, Horn of Africa, Yemen, and a couple of other country situations where they might feel that, directly targeted if we go for the geography of actually including and integrating this in the geography. That would be the next step. Yeah. And it's going to be very, it's going to be a very delicate exercise, I would say. So, if you go, for instance, for South Sudan.
There's a really important flagging that you're giving to people there, because the fact that the resolution has been passed does not itself resolve the problem. It enables further steps towards resolving the problem. And in the same way, the Women, Peace and Security Resolution 1325 opened the way for years of having arguments about exactly how to fulfill it and about setting up the National Action Plan. So this is not the end of the issue. This is actually, in a way, a new beginning for the issue.
Absolutely. But it's also because part of the important key that we rely on in normative sense when it comes to hunger and conflict is of course international humanitarian law. Where we have some basic principles, and the problem now is that we're undisciplined in observing international humanitarian law, and it's willfully too by many actors, including on the Security Council, which look the other way. So we have this is part of a basic tasking that we have and responsibility that we're not shouldering in the Security Council on occasions. Syria is the case, is the most desperate case, but I would say that Yemen is too.
Yeah. Well, on this point, you remember the medieval sieges of cities. They were starving out cities and killing the whole population in a big city in the medieval Middle Ages. We are seeing that in the Syria war. We are seeing it in Yemen. And in my book, these are war crimes. These are war crimes. And but what I think one very important message of this discussion is that if we are to solve the issues of today, we need to not continue to work as we do in silos vertically. We can't deal with conflicts only from the military political perspective. We need to bring in the other actors. We need to see the totality of the conflict and the issues. We need to break down wars between each other, and we need to mobilize other actors. I've been working in the Swedish government, I'm working in the UN, but I can tell you, if these goals are going to be achieved, we have to have a mobilization across the board. And hunger, look at that hunger, second goal. When we negotiated these goals, very ambitious, concluded that they were universal, both valid for rich and poor countries, but we also said they are mutually reinforcing. In other words, how can we deal with that unless we also bring in the issues of agriculture, the issue of institutions, peaceful societies of 16, the issue of partnerships of 17, climate to 13, water 5, isn't it? Or, whatever. So the goals, one of the things that I always say, because I was part of this negotiation, was that we should use them as a catalyst for crossing borders, not only geographic borders, but also functions and actors. If we can do this, I can tell you, that's going to be one of the most important dynamic factors in improving the condition in this world. Conclusion, after many, many years in diplomacy and international relations and fieldwork, is that you've got to go horizontal, and by that I don't mean go to sleep. Go horizontal and also do prevention. These are the two basic goals in order to really have a qualitative change today.
So a couple of things. One thing which I omitted to mention at the beginning is that if you would like to tweet about the meeting, and I hope you would like to, please feel free. It expands the audience. And we've left the Twitter tags of the panel down there if you want to do that. The second thing is I also want to just as I was waving to the lady at the door to come in, I would like to bring you into the conversation. So if you want to ask a question, make a comment,
raise your hand.
Raise your hand and we'll take it. But for the moment, Anne, you wanted to come in on the connecting point, the connective point.
Exactly. I wanted to say with the global goals and the 2030 agenda and the interconnectivity of the goals, it's really a crucial moment in time to address the root causes. We have been, as Dan also alluded to, saving the same lives over and over again because of different, because the system was not really geared to work together, rather than we were working in silos, the organizations were working in silos, donors were working in silos, even specific donors had their siloed funding mechanisms. But I think for once, the entire world came together in 2015 and really adopted and agreed upon an agenda which will address the root causes. And I think that's really unique about the global goals that, and still there's 12 years to achieve the zero hunger and all the other 16 goals.
I'd like to ask both you, Jan, and you, Efraim, the political question. Because this is 2015, the SDGs being agreed, Agenda 2030, the Paris Climate Accord as well. This was a moment of tremendous coming together, both of actors and of agendas. And I mean, people were talking about, and quite rightly in my view, talking about the Paris Climate meeting as being the largest peace conference the world had seen for a whole long time, because climate is also an issue of security. Right? And now we're seeing at the high political level a pushback against that, an apparent move away from multilateralism, as you said, a blinking towards international law from time to time. Just, Jan, from your perspective now, having left the UN system, Efraim, from yours inside the government system, what can happen with the political arguments?
Politics only happens if you do it. And it's the same for multilateralism. You need to do it and practice it.
Right.
And so countries often in the face, if you look at globalization or global phenomena in general, states are empowered when they cooperate and disempowered when they isolate. Yeah. And so the more they cooperate, the more they can deal with the issues that we have at hand. And climate change is a case in point. And we're trying to do that. For Sweden, it's logical. We're trying to embrace the world. We don't shut it out. And so we we'll have a positive view on multilateralism. And I believe that we need to sing the benefits of multilateralism more and be able to communicate it more wisely, even to the ultimate beneficiaries of our work on multilateralism, which is not at headquarters level. It's for persons in the so-called field that we talk about, but it's in Sweden too. I mean, the SDGs, they apply to Sweden too. That's the beauty of it. But for the work in the Security Council, the people who are the beneficiaries of our work are individuals in countries at risk or in conflict. And so that is something that we always need to keep in mind. And the problem when I talk about risk, and this is something that we've dealt with in the past, particularly through CIPRI, which has helped us develop our thinking when it comes to climate change and conflict. Because the Security Council as an organ has troubles dealing with risk, generally speaking. It could be climate change, but it can also be economic risk, for instance. I mean, and on occasions also they relate to each other. If you have mono economies, for instance, you know, that then climate change, hunger, and economic risks all mix. And we don't have, I mean, Jan, you know this, I mean, from your previous capacities, that the Security Council, even though we have an excellent charter, which is quite demanding when it comes to our abilities to prevent, still the Security Council doesn't have a strategy. And it's one of the few security, maybe the only one, security organization in the world with executive powers that doesn't have a strategy to deal with risks. And so all of us trying to introduce these things, climate change and security and climate or hunger and conflict, is a way of developing the risk doctrine of the Security Council so that we're able to integrate it later.
And the SG's prevention agenda, I mean, you
It's
can't
definitely
think about
one of
prevention
those,
unless
yeah.
you think about risk.
But we're rescinded from many of the tools that we had at hand. You know, this in the past we used to have general outlook on risks and of situations of risk, and then sort of a couple of the permanent members have seen to it that we don't longer have this routine briefing. So it's always a high political cost for us to talk about new risk situations, which is unfortunate. We need to talk about Cameroon, we need to talk about the Comoros, about Nicaragua, and maybe if we do it together, jointly, there's a less of a political cost because you don't single out. And so, but I mean, Jan, of course.
No, I think that would be
I think,
fruitful, particularly if you go to areas where conflict could erupt, and where you don't necessarily have the risk of the veto and the veto power being used, because I think that is the biggest obstacle to serious work in the Security Council. Even if with the best analysis of prevention of risks, if you have great power rivalry, they stop action. My biggest frustration during my 5 years recently in the UN was trying to end this horrible war in Syria. But it was tensions first on the level in the country, of course, and then in the region between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for instance, and then on the level of Security Council. So nothing happened. So I think it's a good, interesting idea. If you do risk analysis of countries and get in there early on without the veto shadow hanging over, that's a good idea. But now we go a bit perhaps beyond the theme of hunger, perhaps. But let me say, since you brought up the wider perspective, that 2015 was my best year in the UN. I had this almost depression from Syria. I had gone to Saudi Arabia and Iran to try to prevent the war in Yemen and failed miserably. In Iran, they said, we have nothing to do with this conflict. In Saudi Arabia said, we have to get these people to understand, and we will use military means, and the war will be over. One person said, in 3 weeks. Another person said, 3 months. And now we are more, 3.5 years, I think. So the reason why 2015 was my best year was the SDGs. 25th of September. The Pope was there, gave a beautiful speech, look it up, gave his benediction to our efforts. And I went to sleep with a smile on my face. A couple of months later, we got the Paris Agreement on climate. And the SDGs is a tool to make the Paris Agreement, the 2-degree goal, realistic. So I was extremely proud. By the way, 2016, we got also the theme sustaining peace. The peace is not only, again, military and political, but also development, human rights, and also prevention and post-conflict resolution. Great step forward, both in General Assembly and Security Council. Your question. I can't hide my frustration about the downfall or the degradation of international cooperation. I didn't believe, not even 2 years ago, that I would be sitting and trying to make the case for both democracy and human rights and international cooperation. the most obvious thing that is our tool to make progress for humanity is now being weakened by the month. And I must speak openly, and it's in the room, isn't he? Isn't he in the room, this Mr. Trump? Leaving the climate agreement, the enormously hard work that was put into that, not least by Ban Ki-moon personally. He's not given credit enough for what he did on the climate. And they haven't left the SDGs, fortunately. Probably doesn't know about it. But anyway, then you have migration. They left the negotiations on migration. We're going to have a very important compact, hopefully agreed upon in December this year in Morocco. US has left the negotiations. And then you have the trade, the protections going around the world. We may have a trade war in our hand. And we had this horrible news 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, about US leaving Human Rights Council, where I also played a role in the negotiations. And they say, well, you have Saudi Arabia and China and others who don't respect human rights. That's a good point, but the world is as it is, not as it should be, perhaps. But we need to connect the two, do what we can to reduce the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. But above all, what they do by leaving is that the voices of democracy in the Human Rights Council will be seriously weakened. So I hope to God that this isolationism and America First syndrome will not be moved into the humanitarian area. It is still protected. They are protecting the funding to UNICEF, UNHCR, and World Food Program, I hope.
So at least Congress is.
Yeah, but I don't know, is it correct? That's,
Yes.
So we really have to make the case now, Dan, for international cooperation, that it is not only the right thing to do, it's also, as you said, in the enlightened self-interest. It's for our own security. But I didn't believe that I would be sitting in this situation and try to make these absolutely self-evident things clear.
Well, then, Anne, I wanted to ask you not about the politics of it so much, but about how risk and the political discussions about risk connect with the way that in the World Food Program and in your country program and so on, you're thinking about risk. I mean, do you see a way in which it's possible to get a single conversation, or with many voices, different perspectives, but going on about risk, bringing these different aspects together, or are we kind of doomed to be cooperating within our silos?
Mm-hmm. I think what you said, Jan, to come back to you on it's the right thing to do. I know. I also want to say I think it's the only thing to do. I think it was it Ban Ki-moon who said, we're the first generation who can
end up the extreme poverty.
Can
end
abolish
extreme poverty, and the last generation who can do something about climate change.
Yeah.
And even if this goes beyond a bit on the hunger agenda, I so agree on it. And I really, really think this is why the World Food Program has an office in Copenhagen that covers all of the Nordic countries, because I think the Nordic countries are really key and have been key, not just to the World Food Program, but also in the wider UN system to really make the case for multilateralism. The way that we are funded by Sweden has been for the last 10 years the biggest donor of flexible funds. Sweden do not earmark their funding to the World Food Program. They give us a bag of money every 1st of January every year. Core funding, yeah. And they say to us, spend it where the needs are biggest. So they don't make a decision that we'd rather feed this girl than this girl. And I think the Nordic countries are really proponents of good humanitarian donorship and advocates for the multilateral collaboration. It's true that we see a fragmented world, but I don't think we would never ever reach zero hunger by 2030 or any of the other goals if we don't fix this.
Yeah, I want to say that I'm still open to anybody putting up their hand, and then find there's two. One here, one there.
You take a couple of them. It's one time. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mikaelin from the Church of Sweden. And as you said, where there are conflicts, violent conflicts, there's hunger. And when you have a lot of fuel to the fire, then it's tough to get to the root causes. So how to get away the explosive fuels. So I applaud, and I'm really impressed what Sweden have been doing, focusing on the conflict prevention. and also lately together with the General Secretary on the taking on board and elaborating the disarmament agenda, which I so much welcome. And so the connection, conflict prevention and disarmament, the link is so clear with the SDG also. So my question, as Jan asked about, it's about the mobilization. So it's so great that it exists, the new initiative, and it's so sad that no one hears about it. So if no one hears about it, it's tough to mobilize. I don't think Security Council will be the best place to start it, but outside and start things getting moving, making the linkage, disarmament and conflict prevention, and thereby coming to the root causes.
Yeah.
So give us some hope how to do it.
So that's the challenge, to give hope.
Take a couple of
Take a second
questions.
I understand that the issue is quite complex. At the same time, I'm thinking that we really need some innovative ways to combat those issues. I myself come from Ukraine, and if anyone told me for 10 years ago that we would have a war, I would be quite surprised. Literally said. But Sweden per capita has one of the biggest food wastes in Europe, while 2 hours away from Sweden you have one of the Europe's biggest conflicts. I mean, it just clicks to act in this kind of way. I mean, how can we involve businesses? How can we involve governments to think outside the box, to think outside only the economic perspective and money, but to think in terms of food? Thank you so much for the panel, by the way.
Yeah. Anyone else? No?
Go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
Can you?
Absolutely. I think that, Mikael, you know me, I come from the small arms community myself in the beginning, and we worked a lot on the program of action, of course, and I think that it's getting a bit more re-energized, I would say. I mean, we had the Armed Violence and Development Declaration in 2006, which was a good intent, I believe, to put this question in a broader agenda, but the small arms community has had some troubles engaging, with broader development issues, I should say, for the last decade or so. But I think that we now feel that it's incentivized, and Sweden will definitely play its part in trying to mobilize. And I think that the Arnstrid Treaty was a huge feat that we need to get busy with integrating in different other areas, I would say. But I think that's critically the connection, really, when it comes to sort of the kind of hunger situations that are mostly affected. I would invest a lot on small arms issues. When it comes to food waste, I mean, policy coherence is something that we all must strive for. I believe it's wrong to be incoherent in this fashion, and I think that this government is trying to do a lot, and I think we have enjoyed broad support in the Swedish Parliament for these efforts. But it's something that we think a lot about, and we also think a lot about, all of food, associated issues, even when it comes to food and health. And we just had the Eat Forum in Sweden, which spoke concretely to this, how we integrate thinking about food also in how we develop our health systems.
Yeah.
Well, I think the model of work, in order to sort of be more precise about this horizontal method that I talk about, is that we should try to put the problem in the center. Let's say hunger and particular situation, or water crisis, a glass of water. Put the problem in the center. And then you ask yourself, who can do anything about it? And then you gather the different actors around the problem. We are cursed by thinking in terms of organization and bureaucracy. You start from the UN, Swedish government, whatever, instead of putting the problem in the center. Because if you do the problem in the center, then you start to act dynamic. Then you bring in the private sector, the academic community, the local communities, the civil societies, and you reach then the point of increasing hope. Because no one can escape responsibility. Nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And that work you divide it up. It's like a big torta. You have your cake. You have your little slice. Very thin slice, very big slice. Everyone has a part there. And that is how you mobilize. My family's group, Eliasson Group, I want to make publicity for my group, my family. I'm not Don Corleone, I'm Consigliere. We have put this as our line. If you look us up at on the website, it says, now is the time to mobilize the good forces. That's now. I feel the vibrations, apropos prevention, in the ground. Very dangerous trends right now. Now is the time to mobilize good forces. And this is a way to do it, in my view.
Yeah, I'd like to say on food waste, and it's very good that you raise it. And of course, the overproduction of food and it puts us a huge strain on the climate, for instance. But I just also want to say that the crying fact is that there is enough food in the world to feed everyone. So it's not a matter of lack of food, it's a matter of lack of access to the food. You have Syrian refugees in the countries around Syria, in Jordan and Lebanon, in Turkey and Iraq. There's plenty of food, but they just can't buy it because they don't have anything to buy for it. The way we address in the World Food Programme food waste is that happens not at the consumer level. Whatever gets on the table in the poor family in DRC or in Kar or in Syria, that will be eaten. But so we address it on a more structural level, where it's post-production. It's where in a country where I spent many years, Haiti, they wouldn't have the infrastructure to stock the food and save it until 3-4 months later. They didn't have the roads, they didn't have the infrastructure to reach the local markets.
Yeah.
So addressing these structural problems, but I think it's important to stress that there's enough food for everyone in the entire
And then
world.
also corruption and bad governance.
Of course, coming back to how it's all interrelated, the 17 goals, and on the issue of mobilization and pushing the momentum we have with the security resolution, we realize in the World Food Programme that it puts a huge responsibility on our shoulders as well, because we need to be building the evidence, we need to make the case, we need to document, and that's again why, coming back to the partnership with CIPRI, this is so important for us, because there we have a partner who can, with great authority, help us provide the documentation.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's a way of life in CIPRI that it's the evidence which counts, and we go where the evidence takes us. Right? So, in fact, if all of you and I are wrong in our assumptions that there is a provable link between increasing hunger and increasing conflict or instability, we will be saying so. We might not be saying so with as much enthusiasm as we would if it's the other way around.
I'm going to change this around, because this is the moderator, but I'm going to ask the moderator a question.
Go ahead.
Dan Smith was, not only was he the director of Peace Research Institute in Oslo, but he was also head of an organization which I cooperated with a lot when I was in humanitarian business, namely International Alert, with IA, which was supposed to sort of feel the vibration of the world. Did you see already at the time when you were there how hunger or water was an international alert issue for you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we started out in my time there with this idea, which I had developed out of research, which was of a palette of peace building. And a lot of people use the expression toolbox, and I just found that too mechanistic. It was too much about social engineering. And so, coming myself in the university from a more kind of arts and humanities background, I said, no, it's a palette. And you mix these different colors together. And amongst these colors, right, is everything to do with development. So it's not just about security in the sense of the police force should be behaving in a responsible way. It's not just about political voice, that there should be accountability and people should be involved in the running of their societies and the running of their communities. It's also about access to food. It's also about access to jobs. And things which are less tangible but are just as important. It's about dignity. Right? And we did, while I was at Alert, we did some research in Tunisia trying to explore why were young people in Tunis so quick to connect themselves to what we in the West would call extremist or jihadist agendas. And the biggest single term that came out to try to help us explain that was dignity. So all of these issues fitting together. At the same time, as you said, it's a complex set of issues. I also insist, an awful lot of this is not rocket science. It's really quite straightforward. Bob Marley used to sing songs, which I loved, 40 plus years ago, about, the hungry man is an angry man. Some of these things are really quite straightforward to understand the link. I just picked up on Twitter just before I came in here, something I forget where it was from, that we are seeing a large number of hottest ever days in many places all around the world in the past couple of weeks. Right? The climate is changing. The climate affects water, it affects food, it affects people's lives. It reduces the security of their lives. That social and economic insecurity will feed into political insecurity. This is not rocket science. These things can be understood. And one point which I wanted to make about the mobilization thing, this almost goes against my professional position, right? But I think that what has happened is a professionalization of engagement. So one leaves these issues to the NGOs which focus on it, or the people who really know, right? And I think there are good reasons for that in many ways, and I think that the increase of knowledge and expertise and understanding about many of these issues is to be welcomed. But now I think we have to rebalance. We've got to figure out better ways to get to a democratization or a re-democratization of that engagement. The movement that we saw in the 60s, 70s, 80s, in modern form, taking a different shape, not just repeating, but we need to broaden the basis of that well-informed engagement. So, is there another question to come from there? I'll take my moderator hat back from you now, Jan. Yes?
Okay, I had a very complex thought in my head. I'm going to try to. So we were touching the subject of migration. So I was just thinking that maybe you had a good thought on the matter. If you look at the Refugee Convention, it doesn't really concern climate change at all, and the food security issue that we're talking about here. So what are your thoughts? Should we add climate change to refugee status? So should people who are affected by climate change and have to leave their homes, should they have a refugee status as well, or are we just going to consider them migrants?
Agreed.
Actually, Sweden has been one of the countries within the EU context, etc., that has been working to recognize the effects of climate change on migration, and including forced migration, which would be then refugees. Now, how countries translate their commitments in the international norms that exist on the 1951 Convention, etc., in the national legislations, I think that Sweden has been reticent about sort of fleshing out that, because we want to decide through national legislation which are the circumstances. We don't want countries forbidding us, for instance, when it comes to persecution of LGBTQ persons, etc. So that is the philosophy. But there is a recognition, at least also on Swedish initiative. So we have to work our way through that. But you have to go nationwide, I would say.
No, no.
After you.
No, I just want to say on migration, maybe it's venturing a bit off your question, but on the question of migration, and again, as Dan said, it's not rocket science. People who cannot eat will turn to these negative coping mechanisms, whether it's selling off their assets, selling off their land, their animals. Syrian refugees in refugee camps in Jordan might marry off their girls way too young because that's the only way they can feed the rest of the family. Their young sons might go back to Syria to fight alongside ISIS. And it's not because they're extremists, it's because they need to have food on the table. And eventually that was also, and it's also what's happening every single day, what makes people go on board a rubber boat and risk their lives to cross the Mediterranean. So coming back to food security and migration, we have a report, the Working Program, called At the Root of the Exodus that shows the very clear link of food insecurity. What happens when people cannot no longer put a meal on the table? They will migrate. That has happened over for all the years of million years of existence. People migrate when there's no opportunities where they are.
I was in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam 2 years ago. I was expecting to see green, trees around the delta. Two things have happened: the rising sea level and the lowering of the Mekong Delta because of building of dams around the delta. China and Laos have dams. What is happening is that the salt water from the sea, with the rising level, comes into this sweetwater, freshwater Mekong Delta. And the freshwater fishing is killed off. But worse than that, the ground is very porous, so that the salt water goes into the ground, and the rice fields turn brown, and the cows and the sheep get sick, and the farmers have to desert their farms. And the farmers' sons, 3 of them that I met myself during that whole day, go off to the city where they're trying to get a job. So here is a very concrete example of environmental change and migration, and not yet conflict in Vietnam, but we're going to see that with millions of people moving for different reasons. We are trying to get more of an order into the migration area. We have very little regulation for migrants. We have only migrant workers ratified only by 50 nations, and the most important ones don't ratify. We hope now to make sure that we can be more generous with the definition of refugees. Actually, the Refugee Convention of 1951, which I say we should preserve, don't open that negotiation in the political climate of today. But that actually covers only persecution. I don't think even war is involved. We have added that as a given.
That's right. It's only persecution.
Yeah, it's only persecution. But now we don't even talk about it. But war, fortunately, is now a reason. But why? If you look at the whole Sahel region now, 400 or 500 million people. Yeah. Boko Haram, poverty, drought since 3 years. People are dying. And isn't that a reason for movement? But on the other hand, then you have the whole political problem of Europe and US receiving people of that magnitude. But I think your question is extremely important, and this negotiation, which is so important, and we need to give more attention to the migration meeting in Morocco, that they have to make progress on the definition of, or rather take away, accept the vague boundary between refugees and migrants.
But I think there's a further thing, which is I think that in Sweden, you have to acknowledge that in most of the rest of Europe, it is really difficult to have an adult conversation at the moment about migration and refugees. It's really, really hard. I mean, when I hope you can hear I'm British, and when I look at what is happening to my country, because a total, in my view, con artist as a politician, was able to get away with putting up a completely misleading poster showing apparently huge hordes of people who would be coming into the UK, which was simply not true. Right? But it didn't matter. That fear was enough. And if you listen to talk radio, you listen to conversations where people are phoning in. I mean, sometimes it's scary. So that thing that I was just saying about we need a democratization of informed engagement, we need some way to spread out that, to have a more adult conversation where it's possible to say, look, yeah, we can understand why communities feel destabilized and uncertain if there's a prospect of very large numbers of people coming from other places with different norms and different customs. We understand that, right? We also understand there are horrible problems there which are driving these people, and that we've got to be preventing those problems, but we haven't. So we also need to help manage the situation. And what are the best ways to do this? What are the best compromises between different people's interests? Recognizing that everybody has an interest. You're not a racist if you say, I'm a little bit worried about this, right? And you're not a problem if you say, I need to leave my country and go somewhere else because otherwise my life and my family's life is at risk. So we need that adult conversation, and that I think has been holding us back. And it has, generally speaking, been more adult in some parts of Europe than in others.
I don't think adults are always the best. I must say. I think we should bring in young people much more. We shouldn't only work for young people. We should work with young people.
Yeah, but you understand what I mean. Something in which yes, you have opinions, but you try to relate those opinions to the evidence.
My last word. Do we have a last word?
We're going to have a last word, but first of all, before your last word, I'm going to tell you my favourite recent John Oliver. Go ahead. We're winding up in about 3-4 minutes. Just on this theme, John Oliver recently had on his show coverage of what was being said about the Mueller investigation into Russian influence and so on, and how the use of the word witch hunt was being repeated and repeated and repeated. He took that Fox News host and he showed the man, Sean Hannity, saying, I don't care what evidence you bring, I don't care what proof you bring, I don't believe it. And John Oliver said, wow, this guy is actually proof, which is a really difficult position to be in. But that's where some parts of the political discourse have got to. I don't care what you can show me. I prefer my own thought. Yeah. And that's what I mean by not being adult. We have to get to a point where we say more, okay, this is a hard fact to deal with, but I'm thinking about it. Let's take final thoughts now, a minute or minute and a half each. Along the group, starting Anne and then moving on.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think perception has become king in many ways. But what I think is encouraging on concluding this debate and the lack of multilateral collaboration, international collaboration. What I think is really encouraging is coming to Almaden. It's the first time I'm here, and to see how multilateralism, how the global goals are pretty much everywhere. I think I've seen more global goals pins here than ever before. I was also at the Danish equivalent that we stole from Sweden at the Folkemødet in Almedalen. In Bornholm. Bornholm, yes. And the global goals are pretty much everywhere. So I think that gives ground for optimism, and I think it gives ground for it can only get better from here. Yeah. And it was a Swede who developed these ideas.
Yes, Petrolbeck.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Things are moving in a good way, as well as the ground trembling with problems.
I just want to tell you about something I experienced in Somalia in 1992. It was the worst I've ever seen. I think almost 500,000 people died in 1992. I was there in October 1992. And people died more out of starvation than of war in that situation. We collected people along the roads, brought them to a camp, and tried to make the people survive. We have a fantastic doctors team, and they were fighting to make the children land on the right side of life and death by feeding them exactly the right thing and water. So it was just fantastic to see, very moving. Many of my colleagues got very depressed, and it was just so horrible to see this happen. And then I met a man, and he said, can you imagine yourself, you in this room now, I pass on the question to you, living without food and water, first of all for 3 days. Can you imagine what happens on the 4th day, and the 5th day, and the 6th day, when you haven't had food or water? He said, the varnish of civilization disappears. People steal. If you see your child dying, you are even willing to kill. And he gave me examples of this happening. People were in prison because they had killed to make sure that their children would survive. In other words, the point of this is that we have to avoid this critical stage. It's so unhuman. It's completely beyond the word you wrote in, very important, dignity. We cannot accept that in today's world where we can feed each other and live in peace together, that dignity is not respected.
Yeah.
Should we wait for that moment when people are willing to do anything to survive? No, we cannot do that. And that's why we have to move as rapidly as possible in prevention and to work together. Because if we don't act early, if we don't act together, we're going to fail. But keep this in mind. Ask yourself, what happens if you were to live 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, well, 7 you would probably not live.
Thanks, Dan. Jan, you showed, and Anna too, that this is a real issue. We will definitely deal with it. For Sweden's part, we'll continue to do it in all the ways that we can, to our support to the World Food Programme, in the Security Council, etc. But I would mostly, finally, like to thank the audience for their good questions and also for the good conversation that we've had together. We've not exhausted the theme, and we will have to get back to it. And maybe we could also look at it more in depth when it comes to difficult geographical situations and current ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to thank the audience and hope you will join me in thanking the panel for a really good conversation.